It's funny the things that can scare you. A lot of people are terrified by horror movies of the type that I used to rent out to willing customers every week. Some younger kids were scared even of the images on the box of those films and would shriek and hide behind the legs of their parents rather than look at them. For me, though, the scariest thing in the Morton home video store was a thing so innocuous and unthreatening that had I ever mentioned that I was afraid of it, I would have left my friends laughing for months. It was a zipper. You might have gathered by now that at one point during the late 90s, when I was in my late teens, I was the attendant desk clerk at the video rental place called the Morton Home Video Store. The actual unit in which the shop stood was part of what we used to call the arcade, a covered collection of shops and service providers that wished it was a large American-style shopping mall, but which in reality was far closer to an indoor or covered market. The arcade itself had been there since the 1920s. And since there was both a butcher's and fishmonger's counter inside, had a very distinct and not entirely pleasant smell to it. A sickly blend of chemicals and cleaning products applied in vast quantities to mask the underlying stench of raw meat and decaying fish. In a way, I always thought of that scent as being the smell of Morton, as a town. A cloying and somehow false sweetness resting above and hiding from view. Something hideously dark that lurked and waited beneath. As I say, by the time I worked there in the late 90s, the unit had been converted into a video shop. But as often happens in these kind of places, there hadn't been a great deal of effort put into erasing the remnants of the previous business that occupied the place. Whilst out the front there was a small maze of shelves stacking up with the latest titles and old classics, all on their clunky building block cases. In the back room there was still large frames of chrome metal sticking out from the walls where clothes used to be hung when the unit was a fashion store. At the very back were stacks of spare video cases piled in boxes, made the room seem to angle off to a narrowing point. There were cubicles with curtains to draw across, where at one time people would have presumably have slipped in and out of their clothes to admire themselves in the mirrors, deciding whether or not to purchase them. One relic from this long-departed clothing store that still hung as heavy presence in the storeroom was the zipper. 8 feet tall and stretching from ceiling to floor, the model zipper ran the entire length of the storeroom. I'd always assumed it was a display piece. In some ways it looked like a piece of set design from a 1980s kids TV show, or like one of those clocks designed to look like an oversized watch that hung on a kid's wall. Whether it was metallic or simply plastic painted with metallic parts, I was never quite sure. It was slightly undone at the top, and of a bright silver color that stood out brilliantly against the black painted wall of the storeroom. It was an ornament, a decoration, and essentially a piece of metal or plastic. Yet every time I worked alone in that store, when I closed late at night and would be forced to put the new arrival cassettes in boxes retrieved from the storeroom, I would avoid looking at it. To me, though it ran vertically down the length of the wall rather than horizontally, it still somehow retained the appearance of a giant closed mouth. Perhaps it was the way it contrasted against the color of the wall or way the light would catch it and make it seem to move ever so slightly, but I always got the feeling that it was somehow waiting, resting there against the wall, and that if you got too close it would yawn open and swallow you. It's stupid, I know. Out front was a huge horror selection, boxes covered and painted with every terror and nightmare you could imagine, demons, witches, vampires, and werewolves, all enticing the prospective viewers to take the film to the counter and rent it for the night. These images surely should have been the ones that worried me or played over in my mind, but they weren't. Rather, when the place was quiet, I would think about that zipper. Imagine it behind me. Each tooth fringed, side peeling open to reveal an immense eyeball, the size of a wall, looking out toward me, gazing around the store and surveying me, greedily. I remember once having a nightmare in which the zipper was not closed but open, splayed out to reveal a space that was in some way both behind and inside what should have been a flat wall. A space that, despite being on a black wall, seemed to not only be many shades darker, but to have a depth and dimension within the black, as if there was a space in there beyond the wall and the hanging teeth of the zipper was simply the frame to some treacherous door leading God knew where. The zipper shouldn't have scared me, but it did. I remember one night after closing, I was walking around some of the displays and putting the returns back on the shelves when I heard some kind of fumbling or movement coming from the back room. Part of my job at the store was to make sure that the place was kept clean and tidy, and Mr. Vardy, the owner, was very particular about me sweeping and mopping the place every night before I left. That night, though, I didn't. As I walked around the place in the quiet, still hearing the movement from the storeroom, I began to become nervous about replacing the boxes. Every time I reached up, I knew it meant taking my eyeballs off the doorway that led to the storeroom, looking away from that black rectangle that led to where the zipper stood. Again the sound, like boxes shifting or something heavy pulling and dragging itself across the floor. Rats, I asked myself, or maybe boxes disturbed by some draft entering through a chink in the brick wall. I returned to the stacking, my head filled with strange ideas, questions of what I might do if I was to hear the sound of that zipper slowly but surely undoing tooth by tooth. The distinct ripping snarl of a zipper being pulled down quickly. Would I stay to investigate, or run headlong and without looking back out of the doors into the main arcade and sprint out into the street? What excuse would I give Mr. Vardy for abandoning the business without even closing up? I wasn't considering this when the noise came again. I waited and listened. Stepping out from behind one of the shelves, I tried to reassure myself, to tell myself that I was being stupid and there was nothing there that could hurt me. I picked up the mop, determined to go back into the back room and do what was needed. As I took a step forward, however, I again heard a sound, this time not a shuffling but a slow rasp, which in my imagination could have been nothing else but the deliberate unfastening of that zipper by something waiting behind it. I dropped the mop to the floor with a heavy wooden clack and, fumbling with the keys, hurriedly locked the front gates and left the place uncleaned, the job entirely unfinished. Luckily, from my point of view, I was on the opening shift the following day, meaning that my negligence the night before would never be reported or detected, me being the only person on the unit. In the bright light of day, the things in the store itself seemed clearer, and though the storeroom still stood in shadow, a black recess of space like a cavity in a tooth, I felt nowhere near as apprehensive. I picked up the mop that I let fall unceremoniously to the ground the night before and strode into the back. What met me in there is not a great spectacular horror story, but it was enough to make me not want to work there anymore. At first I thought it was an explanation, for in front of where the zipper ran from ceiling to floor were 5 dead rats. Well, I shrugged to myself, never considering how these rodents met their end. That explains it. The noises were made by rats shuffling around, probably attracted by the smell from the bags of popcorn we sold at the counter to punters renting the videos. It was only when I got closer that I felt my legs go weak. The rats, 5 of them, were lined up almost perfectly facing away from the wall so that their little snouts were pointing in my direction. What I hadn't noticed at first was that there was no back end. Each of the 5 rats had been cut perfectly in half. Actually, that is not quite true. The back half, the rear legs, the tail, and much of the stomach was gone. But to say perfectly makes it sound as if they were divided with some precision or care. They were not. The rats were cut in half, but the dividing line was tattered and mangled. The flesh and innards turned to mince as if whatever had cleaved them in two had chewed them, as if they had been caught in a heavy, forceful snap of crocodile jaws, bitten clean in two by the whirling teeth and cogs of some machine, or by the teeth of an immense silver zipper. I dropped the mop a second time, pacing with speed across the floor, past the boxes and old hangers, out of the storeroom, back toward the counter and out of there. I would have continued walking had I not heard the sound of the zipper opening behind me. I turned slowly and looked. There was no mistake. It stood yawning wide like an entrance or a doorway, or perhaps more accurately, a mouth. Opened by what or whom, I'll never know. Leading to where, I'll never know either. I didn't wait to find out, but instead ran for my life. I've told my story many times, and since the arcade itself burnt to the ground in 2006, it has become a bit of a spooky story told by local kids, none of whom believe it. To them, it isn't real, but to me, it really was. Sometimes now when I pass the new arcade built on the ashes of the old one, I wonder if somewhere under the foundation, the zipper is still there. Whether that gate, portal, or mouth is still waiting submerged below the surface. Most of all, I think about the sounds, for as I turned that night and saw the zipper open, it showed me a tiny glimpse of the darkened hollow space inside. A space which, judging from the wails and screams I heard, must have been very far from empty.